Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, where it's headed. I'm Jeff Pallay. Thanks for being with us today. And apologies in advance, I had some microphone issues on this recording, so if you hear some weird sounds in there, don't blame Frank, you can blame me. That's my microphone issue, and I hope you enjoy the episode anyway. Today, we're joined by Doug Krenzel, a frequent guest on the show, to talk about the State Legislative Competitiveness Index Report. This is one of my favorite reports we publish at Ballotpedia, partially because it's, the first report that I worked on when I joined Ballotpedia in 2010. This is a really in-depth study looking at the competitiveness landscape of state legislative elections, and this is our 14th year publishing this report, looking really closely at open seats, incumbents who are running in primaries, and general election races where there's one or two major party candidates on the ballot. So it's a really interesting topic. I love talking about it, and I'm excited to hear from Doug. So Doug, thanks for joining the show, and let's get into it.
Oh, yeah. This was also the first report I ever worked on at Ballotpedia as well, was the Competitiveness Report 2020.
Hear that.
I know, yeah.
You had to really clean my mess up. I'm very sorry.
It's just a lot of spreadsheets. That's all I did.
I always tell people, but back when I first started doing it, wasn't spreadsheets. It was highlighters and printouts. So it's a very different era back then. So we've come a really long way, but I know what this all means. Why don't you tell our listeners, though, what do we mean by a state legislative competitiveness index, and how on earth does this all work?
Yeah, when people think competitiveness, they tend to think of neck-and-neck races and razor-thin margins, but that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. This report looks more at the presence of competition in general. A better way to think about it is choice and the opportunity to see change in government. If voters don't have much of a choice, there isn't much opportunity for change. That's less competitive. But if voters do have more choices, there's more opportunities for change. So competitiveness, if we say a state is more competitive, that means voters have more choices, more opportunities to affect who's representing them. To calculate competitiveness, we look at three big items throughout the life cycle of an election. The first is open seats. How many seats have no incumbents running? Open seats are guaranteed that you'll get someone new in office. Incumbents in contested primaries. How many incumbents were challenged in primaries? That's a choice. When an incumbent faces a primary challenger, voters could boot them right then and there. And major party competition. How many seats are contested in the general election by both a Democrat and a Republican? Again, another choice. If there's no major party competition, 9 times out of 10, it's guaranteed that the major party who is on the ballot will win. So we calculate a rate for all of these across the country, and then we combine them to create the competitiveness index. Between 1 and 100, lower means less competitive, higher means more competitive.
Yeah, and this is something where we're not taking necessarily a stance, of course, one way or the other, but if incumbents win re-election essentially 95% of the time, then for an election to be more competitive, most likely you would need either an incumbent to be not running, which is why we have open seats, or in a primary, you would need to have an incumbent face opposition, because primaries are very often where the most competitive election takes place, because we know that many districts are essentially districted. They're not necessarily gerrymandered. They could just be districted in a way where it's very clear who's going to win based on some big party affiliation. We always like to say you're hard-pressed to find a Republican state legislator in inner city Philadelphia. You're hard-pressed to find, say, a Democratic state legislator in rural North Dakota. That's kind of the impetus behind looking at the statistics for the study. I like the way you frame it, better than when we did that. It's sort of a pre-election competitiveness look. Sometimes we like to say contested election, but that doesn't sound as nice as competitiveness. So let's talk a little about this year's data. This is the 14th year we've been running this. We did some historical analyses also for years before 2010, but we like to use 2010 as kind of our sort of marker in the sand. So this year, what we're seeing is that there's a little bit of a dip in competitiveness. It seems a little less competitive than some prior years. So when you looked at the data, what did you see? What stood out to you?
Well, the dip this year came mostly from a decrease in the percentage of open seats. So more incumbents were running for re-election this year than in some previous years, and a drop in the percentage of incumbents in contested primaries. The percentage of seats with major party competition actually is up this year, but the decrease in those other two metrics was large enough to kind of cancel that out and then overall lower the metric down. But to be fair, this is our first sort of settled in election cycle following redistricting. Redistricting, which, the census happens in 2020, then redistricting happens over the next couple of years, lines get redrawn. This is our first election cycle where that's more or less all kind of been set up, and we've already had an election under these new lines. When redistricting happens, that first election, before things get settled in, that one tends to be more competitive. In 2012, so that was after the 2010 redistricting, the index was at 35.2, which is pretty high, all things considered. And then that dropped 5 points in 2014. In 2022, we had our most competitive cycle, which was 36.6, and now we're seeing a similar drop down about 3 or 4 points. So it may just be that the reshuffling that we saw with redistricting is mostly done now. People are kind of, like I said, settled in, and we're entering a new decade of state legislative elections.
Yeah, and it bears worth mentioning that you can't actually get a perfectly 100 index, or because of the way the set up. But every year that we've done this study, the competitiveness index has been below 40. So a higher number is more competitive. Realistically, in a perfectly competitive environment, you'd have 100% of incumbents facing a challenger in a primary and 100% of seats with major party competition. And those figures are usually well in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
It's just very infrequently occurring. So there's a lot of competitiveness to be desired, so to speak. I think, it's something that, listeners know we speak very openly and honestly and directly about Ballotpedia neutrality stances and our approach to the content we put out. But if there's one thing that we feel really, we think still abides by all that, it's that voters want more choice at the polls, and more candidates running would be a good thing. We've had you on the show, Doug, talking about lack of contested elections at the local level. It's just a pretty common theme across the country that a lot of our electoral seats are not competitive even before someone steps foot into the polls.
Yeah.
So it really just hasn't changed for the last 14 years. And one thing we've kind of talked about on and off or informally is that no matter how much fire and energy you seem to see and hear and read about in the news or read about on blogs or wherever you get your information, that's not translating to more candidates running for office. 2010, competitiveness index of 34.6. 2024, 14 years later, 33. That's really not a change at all. It's not like people have suddenly looked at the overall electoral landscape and have said, I'm going to start running for office now. So yeah, it's just a really interesting environment.
And I think that one of the things that's one of the reasons why I like the state legislative look at this is because another thing that we've always talked about is that if you're trying to find the politician who can most directly affect your life, odds are they live very close to where you live in your general, the farther down the ballot you go, the closer you get to elected officials who have the most direct effect on your life and how things go in your community. So when people are looking up at the congressional races and the Senate races, that presidential race that draws up a lot of oxygen, there's a lot of discussion and conversation about those. I like looking at the state legislative level because, that's kind of one step down, but one step closer to people where they are. Like you said, it's easy to look at the top and see all this noise and think that must be how it is everywhere. But then we see a report like this and you realize not really the case.
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk about term limits a little bit. So term limits naturally would sort of cause a little more competitiveness because they are requiring incumbents to not run for re-election at a certain point. Now, term limits then can be kind of cyclical. We see this. Michigan is the example that always comes to mind for me because in a state like Michigan, I'm going to get it slightly wrong, but let's just use the made-up numbers for example. If you're term limited out to 2 terms at 8 years total, then there might be a lot of legislators termed out in the first cycle, and then the next cycle, not very many because they're not termed out yet. And then again, the next time there would be. So kind of ebb and flow. What we found this year is that there's a really low number of legislators termed out. I think the lowest that we've seen since we started doing this report in 2010. What do you make of that? What do you think is the cause of that?
Yeah, like you said, fewer than 200 term-limited legislators nationwide. There's 16 states that have term limits. Granted, one of those is North Dakota, which just adopted term limits, so no one's been affected by them yet. But across those states, we have seen this drop in the number of term-limited legislators, and that definitely affects the overall number of open seats nationwide is directly affected by that as well. That's also dropped. Like you said, there's that cyclical nature to it. Another big aspect of it, we had 1 in 4 seats open in 2022, which means 1 in 4 of all state legislative seats are being represented by someone who just got there, who this is their first reelection cycle. They're not term limited, and they're not going to be term limited for a couple more years. Most states that have term limits are around like 8 years, something like that. 4 terms, 8 years, something along those lines. If you look at kind of the previous decade and you look at the open seats in like 2018, 2016, 2020, it was about 25% of those open seats were term limited legislators. And now we're at about like 16% or something like that. So we're kind of at the start of a new cycle. I wouldn't be surprised if by 2026, 2028, 2030, we're seeing, again, that kind of increase up and see the number kind of get a little bit bigger before it takes a drop down with the following cycle. If you look at like the 10 states that have the most open seats, the highest percentage of open seats this year, 9 of them have term limits. Wisconsin's the only one on there that doesn't have term limits. But having term limits doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have more open seats. Oklahoma and Arkansas are both in the bottom 10, and they both have term limits. Granted, their term limits are like 12 years or something like that. So it's a longer period of time that you got in those states.
Yeah, right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the state of uncontested elections. And again, for full disclosure, when we say uncontested, we specifically mean seats with no major party competition. There certainly could be very many, minor party candidates on the ballot. We specifically use the definition around a major party candidate when we say an uncontested general election, because 99% of state legislators are a D or an R. Then the odds are if only one of those major parties on the ballot, then there's a 99% chance they're going to win. So in terms of whether or not it's contested or competitiveness, that's the sort of definition we use. And this year, 38% of state legislative seats are uncontested. And how does that compare to prior years? And what do you think that says about the legislative landscape this year?
Well, I mean, I will say, all things considered, 38% is pretty low. Because that means around 62% of all seats feature both a Democrat and a Republican, which is actually one of the larger percentages we've seen since we started doing this report. Major party competition, I'd say, unlike some of the other metrics, tends to flow with political energy, or I don't know if that's the right way to put it. But like if you look at previous years, 2010, Tea Party, lots of major party competition. 2018, Blue Wave, lots of major party competition. 2020, presidential election, COVID, lots of major party competition. 2024 is actually 4th on the list behind those 3 election cycles. One of the things that I always find really interesting when looking at, this is a plug for the graphics that we have, because the graphics I feel like do a very good job of illustrating this, is seeing where the shift is coming from. In 2022, a quarter of all the seats had only a Republican on the ballot, and less than that, 16% had only Democrats on the ballot. But now, in 2024, 19% have only Republicans and 20% have only Democrats. That means we're seeing more Democrats challenging Republicans in places they previously weren't doing so, and we're seeing fewer Republicans challenging Democrats. The most apparent states where this is happening, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Florida. These are all 3 states where Republicans hold majorities in both legislative chambers, but in all 3 of those states, the number of Democrats on the ballot is greater than the number of Republicans on the ballot. In Florida, Democrats are contesting all 140 seats, and Republicans are only contesting 119. Maine is the only state where the opposite is true. It's Democrats control it, but more Republicans are contesting seats than Democrats are, 176 to 174. Now, to be fair, like what we were saying about districts earlier in the conversation, this doesn't mean that the majorities are going to change. It doesn't tell us anything about that. That's not what the competitiveness report does. But it does tell us the nature of the choices voters in those states will get to make in November. In those 140 districts in Florida, my guess is that a large number of the Democrats that are running in all 140 of them, there are some that are going to be very difficult for a Democrat to win in just by the virtue of like the makeup of that district. But the voters in that district still get a choice. when it comes time to cast their ballot in November, which is not the case in other states.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what kind of impact that has on things like ballot exhaustion, where, in the past you might have said, well, I don't really, have a candidate who I want to vote for here. I'm just going to skip this race.
Mm-hmm.
And, does that change? Does that impact that situation? Now, that could be interesting to see how that shakes out. But you're right. And some of our listeners might have seen these stories, but there were some direct concerted efforts by some of those state parties to try to recruit a candidate for every district, which is interesting because over the many years of doing this study, I've seen parties talk about that in the past, and they usually don't come very close to accomplishing that.
Yeah.
Partially because ballot access can be very hard and complicated, and not everybody wants to run for office. So, yeah, for listeners who haven't looked at the report yet, the visual that shows the sort of the changes in those numbers by party really helps you understand the data. So, what other trends are we seeing with respect to Democratic and Republican incumbents and primaries?
Yes, I mean, just under a quarter of the incumbents who are running for re-election this year faced a primary challenger. That's down from a record high 27% in 2022. It's more par of the course with what we're used to seeing. So it's nothing like super out of the ordinary this year with regards to incumbents and contested primaries. In terms of like party-specific information, it's sort of a numbers game. Since 2012, the number of Republican incumbents contested in primaries has always been larger than the number of Democratic incumbents. That's because since 2012, there have been more Republican state legislators than there have been more Democratic state legislators. But when you look at those numbers as a percentage of all the incumbents running for re-election, a quarter of the Republican incumbents faced contested primaries this year, compared to 17% fall Democratic incumbents. So again, this is one of those metrics where that's pretty normal as far as like what we've seen in previous years. It's typically the case where Republicans have more contested incumbents in primaries than Democrats do, even when you're looking at it in terms of a percentage. Definitely in terms of raw numbers, because in terms of numbers, there are more Republicans in state legislators, but also in terms of percentage as well.
Yeah, sort of tangent report that we produce is about the incumbents defeated in state legislative primaries, which is always really interesting because, again, one of the reasons why we say having an incumbent contested matters because incumbents almost always win. So 95% of the time, the incumbent wins re-election in a primary. What was pretty interesting this year was a sort of continuation of a trend we've seen since 2010, a little more factional conflict within the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. And where you see this play out this year is, of the Republican incumbents who filed for re-election and then faced challenger in a primary, 5% of those incumbents were defeated, which is a very low number. It means 95% of those Republican incumbents won re-election in the primary. But for the Democratic incumbents, 1.5% of those incumbents lost, which means you essentially saw 3 times as many Republican incumbents lose a primary challenge. And that's pretty consistent with what the numbers we've seen over the years. Pretty consistently, Democratic incumbents, they don't face a ton of primary challenges that lead to losses. But we do see quite a bit of that factional conflict play out within Republican primaries. So the highest number we had was 150 Republican incumbents were defeated last year, which is partially a matter of redistricting. But yeah, see how those primaries shake out. It's always really interesting to see how that plays out.
I remember there being some wild stat in Idaho last year where I think I had to like add a whole new category to the map to like categorize the percentage of incumbents that were defeated in Idaho in contested primaries in 2022. Like that.
There's quite a bit of factional conflict going on out in Idaho, which that's a whole nother podcast episode to talk about that. So let's talk a little bit about another state. Let's talk about Michigan. Michigan usually wins or comes in the top 5. And so this can be kind of an instructive example as to how this report that we produce works and what it tells us about state legislative elections. So what makes Michigan so competitive in terms of our report structure?
Well, I do need to stop for just 1 second because, like you said, Michigan is usually towards the top. In fact, since we started the report in 2010, Michigan has always ranked as the most competitive state, had the highest competitiveness index until 2024. This is the first year that we've done this report where Michigan has not been at number 1. Now it's at number 5. So, still pretty high up there. But actually, Nebraska is up at the top this year, largely because of a huge amount of open seats that they had in their legislature. But Michigan, it is still a good example in terms of like how the index works. The biggest change for Michigan, actually why it dropped down to number 5, is because the open seats dropped so low. Only 7% of the seats in Michigan are open this year, which is down from over 40% in 2022 and far below their average of right around 40% over the past decade plus. So really kind of like outlier data in that sense. But with those open seats going down, that also then affected their competitiveness index. But the reason why Michigan tends to be so close up at the top has been, and still is this year, their major party competition. Since 2010, voters in just about every district in the state of Michigan have had a choice between a Democrat and a Republican every time they go to vote. From 2014 to 2018, every single seat had major party competition in Michigan. And then this year, only one district lacks major party competition. There's one district where there's only a Democrat on the ballot. All the other seats up for election, you've got a choice between a Democrat and a Republican. And that really has contributed to the size of Michigan's competitiveness index over the past few years. And it hasn't changed. Like they still routinely and still now have a lot of major party competition in Michigan.
Yeah, the next year where Michigan's lowest open seat figure was 20. So
yeah,
to go from 7 to 20% is certainly quite a bit different. Other states that are somewhat similar to that and end up in this sort of 99-ish range would be like Minnesota, 95% this year. Maine is around 88, Ohio, 86. But Michigan is almost always near the very top. And New Jersey, I think, is usually quite high, but they're an odd year.
Yes.
So we're not talking about New Jersey to start our home state.
We'll see it here, same time, same place next year.
That's right. Yeah.
For our New Jersey chat.
Yeah. What else should listeners look out for in the report, Doug?
I mean, there's just a ton of interesting stuff in there. If you go to the report, you can jump off to detailed breakdowns for all the different data points that we've been talking about. There's also extra data that doesn't get factored into the competitiveness index, but is still really interesting. We have data on the total number of contested primaries with or without an incumbent. That's also down this year. Like you said, you can learn about incumbents defeated in primaries. After November, there will also be information about incumbents defeated in general elections. Bunch of cool maps, charts, state-specific breakdowns, anything you really could want. So, I mean, I know that you and I might be a little biased here in terms of like our affinity towards the competitiveness report, but I really encourage listeners to check it out, see where your state ranks, go check out your state, all the historic information for your state, see what state legislative competitiveness is like where you live.
There are 19 chambers in 14 states where one party is essentially guaranteed majority status simply because the other party, the minority, did not field enough candidates, or even if they happened to win every seat that the party had a candidate in, they still wouldn't have a majority. So those are the kind of numbers and things that you can learn from this report. I love this report. I talk all day about it, Doug, but unfortunately, we're not going to talk anymore about it. But if listeners want to talk about it, you can email us. Doug and I will talk about it all day. So,
oh yeah,
it's great to see you, Doug. And I'm going to see you very soon, actually, in person. So,
see you soon. Thanks so much,
Doug. And for our listeners, you can learn more about the State Legislative Competitiveness Report at our link in the show notes. We'll be back next week on the ballot. Make sure you subscribe to wherever you listen to your podcasts. And I'm Jeff Palais. Thanks for being with us today.